considering monitoring and evaluation of your programs. To start off, a little bit of background on who I am. My work focuses specifically, I come from the future work policy advising both government and private and public sector on really how to prepare for the next generation. That started particularly in engaging millennials and the next generation. And if we have NGOs on board, the next generation of your donors and volunteers. But when you look at next generation, it's really not just young people. We are really seeing a shift in how we do business and how we engage with organizations, perhaps driven by the younger generation, but more largely due to the digitalization, technology entering the workforce, and just how society is evolving because of that. In addition to that, I'm quite involved in the Sustainable Development Goal conversations. For the past 2 years, I've been working both with stakeholders to activate young people around the SDGs, but then also particularly on the role of volunteerism in impact measurement. That includes being a partner of Volunteer 2030, Impact 2030, and a variety of the main United Nations events and forums around these topics. I'm speaking today on behalf of my company, MyEffect, and the applicability of MyEffect to these conversations is what we focus on is specifically helping organizations capture and communicate their impact. The way we do this is by leveraging the tools of technology and data, but to advance global public good. That is my mission, and what we've done is we've created a solution that allows people to share their impact stories, but with validated data that confirms those achievements. So allowing third-party funders, donors, even volunteers to be able to trace your impact, so you have that trusted data. What that does is give you a very unique mechanism to track a variety of different, pretty much any task-based activity. Things like your classic volunteer programs and volunteer hours, but expanding that further into fundraising, community service learning, and particularly of relevance to our conversations today, actions towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So, why we're all here today? Why are we talking about impact? Why is impact measurement so important today? The first consideration is the value it means to individuals today. Particularly if we look at the community giving and volunteer sector, 93% of people who give back or get involved do so because they want to make a difference. Impact innately is a huge driver in why people get involved for a cause, participate either with their time or their money. But classically, the way our traditional model looks, we emphasize a lot of the administration and logistics of program, and the impact component at the end tends to be the small component of the larger picture rather than the emphasis. I look particularly on things like when we look at like a charity navigator or stars, and we look at an efficiency of an organization, and we're validating right now an organization's worth by how efficient their administration can be and how little we can put the dollar to administration. But really, does that measure the impact of an organization and their programs? Can an organization who may require a little bit more in administration have a better return on impact rather than a return on just investment in terms of dollar efficiency? And I truly believe as we dig further into this conversation and move forward, that this emphasis on the importance of impact on that bottom line will increasingly grow. And I will explain a little bit of why I think that is. One of the reasons is powered by millennials. This is a generation that is looking for value-added experiences. And particularly when it comes to getting involved in community, they're getting involved, to make a difference perhaps, but 77% to make good use of their skills or to develop new skills. Volunteerism and community service learning and all of these activities that could address the SDGs actually provide a very critical opportunity for the next generation and professionals to develop new skills, expand their experiences, and personally grow. And when you look at this generation that we're entering into a workplace where we don't know necessarily what the future of jobs are, the emphasis on personal development and skills training is increasing. So having these value-added experiences that can capture the impact of your programs, both from a societal perspective and from an individual perspective, can actually help you recruit and foster loyalty among participants or supporters. And this is, and look, building on this shift, what we're going to find is we're moving into a generation. If many of you may have already noticed this perhaps in some of your programs, if you do annual campaigns and fundraisers and things, you may have started to see a shift where we're moving away from just wanting to write checks. The classic, I wanted to write a check or automatic payroll deduction and straight donations is changing. And this is due to a couple factors, one being donor fatigue and the inflow of this information overload and constant asks that individuals are getting to give back to causes. The second being digitalization. And the more we see this increase in technology within our lives, the more we emphasize or appreciate the people connections. And kind of for every trend, there's a counter trend, if you want to think of it that way. The more digital we get, the more important or memorable those people connections and experiences get. So the value of community-based activities will continue to increase, contrary to some people's belief that digitalization will just make us all work at home and be on our computers more. We will want to get out more. And thirdly, because of millennials in the workplace, as mentioned earlier, this next generation is really driving the shift to those value-added experiences, emphasizing impact and purpose in their relationships, both in the workplace and outside. And because of that, we are moving into a generation that is emphasizing impact and experiences, the value of those experiences, so time over money. Why care, particularly as I've mentioned the millennial generation, the next generation quite a bit. One particular of relevance from the nonprofits and organizations on this call, millennials are going to be significant benefactors of wealth transfer, meaning they are your future of giving. If you are not already targeting millennials as donors and considering them in your fundraising and giving strategies, they will become a critical demographic for you quite soon. The second benefit is, and why this matters even more, is they will stop donating. More than 3 out of 4 millennials will stop donating if they do not see how their donation is making an impact with your organization or the cause they care about. So tracking and capturing your impact, more importantly, communicating that impact, not just to funders and sponsors, but to your actual supporters and donors is a very critical consideration. It's something that can influence the success of some of your fundraising initiatives. For those employers and private sectors on the call as well, impact and millennial engagement within that sense is not just a consideration for the nonprofit and civil society. It does make a difference in your workplace as well. Ethics and sustainability is this top decision maker criteria for millennials when choosing an employer aside from job security, and passion is second to that. Giving back improves loyalty among all employees, not just millennials, with 93% seeing that if they work for a company that cares for them as an individual, and 50% who will not if they don't have a strong environmental or sustainability or social component to their company. And impact reporting does have a very prosperous, promising bottom line if you can communicate that well, with Unilever estimating about $1.2 trillion in an opportunity for companies that can measure and communicate that impact to consumers. We are moving into a generation on the consumer side as well that we're looking at conscious consumers. And every time we purchase something, that is a vote for what we stand for and what we care about. And if you have 2 comparable products with comparable price and quality, what's going to make me pick that product over another? Well, the impact does add that value. It is a product attribute at the end of the day. So when we're talking about impact, I want to preface for all those private sector listeners that there is value to you as well. And all of the applications that I'm going to explain moving forward, although I may use some examples within a civil society and nonprofit lens, they're quite transferable when you consider an employee demographic or a consumer relation and loyalty perspective. So how do we actually communicate our impact as an organization? I'm going to go through a couple mechanisms, particularly what we'll look at and how MyEffect helps organizations is through recognition and reporting, so actually recognizing the individuals for their impact as they contribute. Volunteer profiles. Again, this can also be employee profiles, or what we've done with MyEffect is we've invented what we call impact resumes that are living profiles that capture the individual achievements of an employee or a volunteer, and particularly give them insights into the impact of their actions or engagement with an organization. Achievement badges, so incentive and kind of gamifying, think of it like a Fitbit for social impact. How can you provide small measurable goals and milestones that people can strive to achieve and build a little bit of that challenge and incentive? And then finally, impact, validated impact data. At the end of the day, I think this is probably when the values of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know Jennifer will touch on this further in terms of what the Sustainable Development Goals bring to kind of mapping impact and indicators, but the standardization and kind of the universal acceptance of these targets and goals provide you with a mechanism to give validated data to third parties without having to continually have to redo your metrics or customize metrics to meet the funder's specific kind of company lens. We now have a universal framework that everyone can kind of rally behind. How MyEffect particularly, this is one application of how you can use technology to capture your impact. We've created a platform that allows individuals to essentially find, track, and share their contributions to the 2030 agenda. How we do this is we enable organizations to align their programs and objectives and post opportunities, which we call actions. An action can be a volunteer program, an event, an internal workplace fundraising campaign, any task-based activity that addresses one of the targets of the SDGs. Individuals can search for those opportunities in our database, and our database can connect with existing volunteer search portals and such. And what we do from a user side is we allow users to set goals, and we make the goals very relevant and tangible to them. I find the SDGs to be very, they're ambitious, and they can seem sometimes overwhelming or lofty, particularly from an individual standpoint or even a local organization. So what we try and do at MyEffect is bring it down to that local level and show how individual actions can still contribute to these larger goals and targets, and helping them visualize that. As you can see here with some of the screenshots, on our impact profiles, you can kind of see the goals, and if you click on a goal, you can kind of see all the actions that you've taken towards that goal. So really, again, making it very visual, tangible, to help kind of motivate in supporters or participants along to continue to stay engaged in your programs. Another focus we have is bringing it to a more user-friendly level. Sometimes when we look at something from some impact measurement and monitoring and evaluation, it can seem overwhelming and very, I don't want to say clunky, but tedious and complex. When we look at, there's 17 goals, 169 targets. It can seem very complex when you're looking at individual, how can I address this? So what we try and do is make it very user-friendly, take a user-friendly approach and enterprise second. And so we do this by helping kind of you translate your programs into opportunities that are shareable. They can find it on their mobile, track their activities on the go. And what we do is all of your activities are aligned with an SDG. You can see here on the corner. So they're able to be searchable. But at the back end, because while the user side is very friendly and it serves just like maybe like a social network experience for an individual, on the back end we have all that metadata on the targets that are aligned with that activity and the impact outcomes. So we kind of put a nice skin or polished, friendly skin on what is very kind of still measurable, traceable data for you. And that's really kind of what we look to do, is bridging that gap. Because at the end of the day, all of these activities, when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and looking to achieve any goals, we look at it from a UN perspective, we're looking at it from a policy lens. Then we look at it from a government or a kind of a regional lens. And we're now looking at it from an organizational lens here in this webinar. But at all of these levels, at the end of the day, we do need, it does have to go down to the people level. If we're running a volunteer program that is or an event or a tree plant or anything that is addressing a goal, it's still the volunteer, the employee, the citizen that is actually participating in that action and executing on that goal. And so I think it's important to remember, how do we localize these actions? How do we make them relevant to people, and help emphasize the role people and individual volunteers or employees have in the Sustainable Development Goals? Because in order to achieve any of our organizational targets, we do need their buy-in and we do need their participation. So the process, in terms of a case example of how you as an organization can kind of, what the process you would go through on a tool such as MyEffect, or even aside from MyEffect, if you're just looking at your own programs, the first step I recommend is you align and recruit. So in the context of the sample I've given you, you would post actions available to your individuals or companies that address the SDGs that your organization is targeting. Each SDG has its own targets within those 17 goals. So what we basically do is we start with, okay, so you have an action, and let's say it's a knowledge. We're doing a knowledge activity. So we are doing a peace building workshop, training young people on conflict resolution and mitigation skills. So we're hosting this knowledge for change workshop, for instance. What we can do then is understand, what goal does this align with? Okay, goal 16, addressing peace and justice. So then what targets are addressed underneath that? So what we do is you start with the big kind of looser goal or the action, and then we break it down. Okay, what is the goal? And then under that goal, then we align with you the targets. So it helps kind of bring that process down, and along that way you might identify what skills are involved for the individual. From there, you have an action, and you can recruit individuals to come out to your activity and participate in building those conflict resolution skills. From the user side, it's very fun and engaging, where they're looking to address SDG 16, so they find your activity, they sign up for it, they come out to your event or your workshop. The step 2 is monitoring and reporting. The way that we use technology is we have a mobile app that allows you to track that activity, but there could be other ways that you might be tracking it. Maybe you're still using manual kind of registration format, so you're just looking at the registration list of who showed up to your workshop. There's different ways that you can track that, but the idea is kind of you report and monitor that activity. With MyEffect's tools, we capture that in real time. So I show up at your workshop, I check in with our mobile app. So our app tracks my time that I'm at the workshop. When I'm done my activity, I get a cool pop-up that says, I just participated in in addressing SDG 16 with this organization, and I share it out and I'm empowered, and that goes on my impact resume. So I'm building my impact profile about how I'm addressing SDG 16 because I'm very passionate about creating peace and reconciliation in my community. When that happens, though, your organization gets real-time data, and you can keep a pulse of who's attending your workshops, who is planting the trees across the country, all of these different things in real time. And the value of doing this is it's validated. What we focus on is having that validation, and the SDGs give a framework to have validated data that is universally accepted. This is kind of where I think the best value is to aligning your metrics towards a sustainable development goal as opposed to perhaps your own individual organization metrics. Most organization metrics, I will preface that you're already probably addressing the SDGs, even if you don't realize it yet. Generally, how I see the SDGs is their buckets: climate action, poverty, education, workforce development. They're buckets that generally organizations already have some sort of metric or framework around. You're just not using the same terminologies and tools. So as soon as you map your impact to your current custom metrics to these SDGs, what it does is it gives you a universal framework that allows you now to align with private sector. A lot of multinational companies and organizations are aligning all their corporate social responsibility and giving to these SDG frameworks because, again, it gives them a more universal framework to roll out across their regional departments and their initiatives. Governments are aligning, and citizens are starting to learn about these frameworks and starting to look at their community, the community challenges they're seeing in this frame of mind. So what it does is if you're capturing data in alignment with these buckets, it allows you now to have that validated data that can be accepted by these different stakeholders without you having to reskin your data, capture new metrics that are custom for every different organization. I know that right now that happens a lot between nonprofit organizations and private sector funders, where each a private sector funder will have its own kind of KPIs that they look for from their nonprofit partner, and that puts a lot of onus on the nonprofit partner to continually track all these different indicators that may or may not be different than what they're already tracking. So by aligning the SDGs, you kind of can alleviate some of that friction and hopefully create a more universal impact metric. And I will, certainly I can dig into some of these conversations a little bit deeper, but I don't want to take up too much time too, because I know Jennifer will build on this a little bit more in talking about how you can map that out, and particularly why mapping out across the SDG indicators is of value. I will preface that some of the tools that I've mentioned here today, they're also all free for nonprofits and charities and for users. So if you're interested in learning more about how you can use some of our free impact reporting tools, whether that's for recruiting volunteers and managing supporters, or whether that's to export reports on your SDGs, feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to explore how we can support you. And of course, I'll answer questions at the end of the webinar as well. But yeah, definitely kind of think from the lens of we're moving from a society where purpose and impact is becoming not just an extra nice to have, but an essential component of how you build relationships with consumers, volunteers, and supporters, and how you retain their interest. Loyalty is really dependent on this impact. So finding a way to capture and communicate that for your organization is valuable, and the SDGs give you a way to do that that is very transferable across the different stakeholders that you may engage.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I really appreciate those insights, and especially, I mean, I just want to touch base. What is a KPI? I haven't heard that before.
Oh yes, my apologies. Key performance indicator.
Key performance indicator. Thank you.
So they would be like the metrics that you would use to measure the success of your program.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, if anybody else has any other questions for Kelly that might be coming into head from her presentation, please just type them into the chat box. on your screen, and we'll come back to those at the end. But I'm going to keep the conversation moving now. I'm going to ask Kelly if you'd be able to stop sharing your screen. And I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer from the International Institute for Sustainable Development to look at how monitoring and evaluation frameworks can connect to the Sustainable Development Goals. So Jennifer, over to you.
Hi, thanks a lot, Dan. I'm just going to share my screen with you right now. I just need to find it. Okay, can you see a presentation there?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Just let me put it into slideshow view. There we go. So, yeah, today we're going to be talking about showing your impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much, Kelly, for really emphasizing that why it's important piece and some of the ways that you can do that to show your impact really at the individual level and working within organizations to track and monitor the impact. I'm going to be speaking a little bit more from an institutional wide perspective and how organizations and private companies can use their existing monitoring and evaluation frameworks to connect that to the SDG framework and show impact in that way. So really the question that we're asking here today is, how do civil society organizations and private companies communicate their contributions to the SDG targets and in their own communities and within the countries where they're working, and really why does this matter? So globally, 193 countries, all of the UN member states, they've signed on to the 2030 agenda, and they've committed themselves to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As a set of universal goals, they do apply to all countries, not just in the developing South. And so nations are taking action at home in their own countries through SDG integration into national policies. For example, here in Canada, the federal government has integrated the SDGs into the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. And they're also doing this abroad through prioritizing official development assistance funds to SDG focused areas. Canadian policies really focus around feminism and feminist policies, as well as security and strong democracies, for example. In addition to that, SDG 17 is particularly important because it focuses on partnerships for the goals, and that really includes prioritizing official development aid around the SDGs in order to increase funding to achieve the 2030 agenda. So while governments are, as I said, the primary signatories of this agenda, really they can't achieve the goals targets alone. It's really important that civil society and the private sector, that they have a very essential role to play in reaching those targets. In reality, organizations and private companies, through their social corporate responsibility programs, they've been working towards these goals for a long time without calling it that. And so this is a really nice way to be able to frame what organizations and individual groups are doing into this one standardized framework. The main challenge is really to align the activities that groups are doing with the SDGs, and then to measure progress in a way that shows linkages between activities and also highlights those the gaps in regards to the SDGs to show where they're apparent. So we do know that right now, for a more comprehensive picture of impact, governments can't rely on just national statistical agencies to track that progress. And also that civil society and private sector, they really do have a really essential role to play in achieving the 2030 agenda. It cannot be achieved without them. So why use the SDGs as a framework for monitoring impact? Now, some of these are pieces that Kelly definitely touched upon. The first one being that idea of standardization. So the standardization of indicators, it can help to demonstrate collective impact across local, regional, and national levels. And it shows the ability to demonstrate how one organization's individual outcomes impact regional outcomes and country outcomes. And this is important from an overall sustainable development perspective. as well as a very, very powerful communications tool. Everyone, funders included, they really like to know how their individual contributions fit into that larger impact picture. Secondly, this is a very good internal program evaluation piece. Because the SDGs are useful for internal, the SDGs are useful for internal program evaluation, in part because while not all programs are, not all programs will align with all of the goals, but by analyzing the connections between current monitoring and evaluation frameworks and the SDG indicators, you can see that where maybe you thought a health program was only connected to SDG 3, focusing on healthy communities and healthy people, when in reality it actually, that same program actually touches on gender issues, so SDG 5, or no hunger, SDG 2, and maybe it also connects to clean water and sanitation, SDG 6. So in this way, it enables a health program to talk about how it is impacting on a more systems level, a more broad spectrum of issues than just health. Thirdly, so the SDGs, they provide a very, very important piece around outside validation for programs that are already existing. So that's really, really important, because all of these individual organizations, they know personally that they're doing a good job, but it's very helpful to have the SDGs as a globally agreed upon framework to also back that up and validate. And then finally, by adopting the SDG framework wherever possible, it really does provide a strong case for funders who are also trying to align their priorities to the SDGs. So what does this process look like? Essentially, this is a mapping process that can be done at 3 different levels. So I'm going to take you through these 3 different levels: the program or sectoral level, the regional, and the national levels, to show you sort of how this mapping process might work. So we'll start with the program or sectoral scale. Here, what we're really trying to do is just to take our existing program monitoring and evaluation framework with all of the outcome indicators that are present, and the Sustainable Development Goals framework that has the 169 targets, as well as the over 300 individual indicators. So when aligning these 2 documents or frameworks together, some of the questions you might want to ask yourselves are there similarities and obvious alignment between the 2 sets of indicators already? If so, that's fantastic. That makes your job a lot easier. Are there gaps where indicators are seen as important to one framework, but are missing in the other? That sometimes happens, and it's not necessarily that you should remove those indicators and say they're not important because the SDGs say they're not included in the SDGs. But they're definitely pieces that you can highlight as saying this is supplemental, and it's very, very important to our own program or our own community in the area in which we work. Are there similar or proxy indicators? In many cases, there is, you might be measuring an indicator, but it doesn't necessarily match up exactly to the indicators that are included into the SDG framework. That's entirely possible, and it's perfectly fine. Again, you may just have those proxy indicators, and you can connect them to targets. That's an acceptable way of doing that as well. There doesn't ever have to be 100% alignment. If you can get as close as you can, that's great. But if you can't, those proxy indicators are also very important. And then, I guess 2 other questions that you can ask yourself are: does that alignment with the SDGs? Will it change program objectives at all? And are communities are community needs still being met properly? Are they still being measured properly based on any new indicators that you might include within your framework, or indicators you might decide to remove as a result? So with all of this information, organizations can begin connecting program outcomes to SDG targets. And so that's how they can communicate SDG impact at an organizational level. So I did a review of a monitoring and evaluation framework for a program based in Uganda. And this program, it focused mainly, was mostly a health program, but it focused on health education and livelihoods and food security. And so when looking at these two documents, I noticed that the overall objectives of the program, there were 4 objectives, and those 4 objectives, they connected to 7 different SDG goals. The health-oriented work, it aligned with 9 different indicators across 3 goals, SDG 2, 3, and 6. And in this instance, there were 2 program indicators that connected to 2 SDG indicators each. So what I mean by that is, for example, one of the indicators that was included was the percentage of women adopting management conditions that contribute to maternal and child nutrition. That program outcome connected to SDG 2.2.1 and 2.2.2, which is the prevalence of stunting and the prevalence of malnutrition. Now, those weren't, obviously those indicators are not exactly the same, but they are similar enough. And if this organization was interested, or if they were able to, they could take their monitoring and evaluation process one step further and potentially actually report on those 2 specific indicators if they wanted to. Within the area of education, we saw that those 9 objectives and 10 indicators were connected to 2 indicators and 1 goal. Now, this was because the majority of the work was connected to it was really focused on access to improved infrastructure, supplies, and improved learning conditions. And so all of these different indicators that they had, they really connected and corresponded to SDG 4.A.1, which is the proportion of schools with access to electricity and internet and different sorts of technology, and really that infrastructure and services that are needed to provide good education to students. The second indicator, it was actually connected to a target, which was by 2030 to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. So finally, the livelihoods and food security piece, it was really interesting for me because the work corresponded to 6 indicators, not 5, within the goals, within goals 1 and 2. But there were gaps where the program really focused on farmers' knowledge of business and development of added value products, but that was not captured within the SDG indicators. So once you've done this mapping process, and you have a good idea of where your organization sits in comparison to, and what you can track as far as the SDGs are concerned. I'm going to skip to the national scale and talk about this piece first, because at the national scale, this is a very similar process in that because there are a lot of different sorts of documents that can be used, it's fairly easy and straightforward to be able to then map the information that you have about what SDGs you are now able to track, and national priorities and information that the country that you're in is already collecting and reporting on. So these are just several different examples of different kinds of policy documents and strategies that could be used to help map this your SDG impact at a national scale. So as signatories of the 2030 Agenda, countries are actually mandated to report on SDG progress, and they do so through the Voluntary National Reviews, or VNRs. Countries don't do this every year, but at some point in time during up to 2030, this will have to happen, which is nice. So in connecting your organization's SDG impacts to national priorities, this also really helps to communicate that important alignment between the priorities and the work of individual organizations and what the priorities of the countries are. So there, like I said, there are many different strategies that you can, or documents and strategies that you can use. And likewise, the VNR is probably the best place to start because it can provide a guide to the types of data and indicators that a country is using to measure progress towards the SDGs, and you can also use it as a comparison between your SDG mapped programs and indicators to reveal where measurement efforts are helping to address national reporting gaps. So both VNRs and the national determined contributions, both of those documents are actually, they're very important because they are voluntary agendas that governments have signed on to, which means that there's a really important role for civil society organizations and for the private sector to ensure that governments stay on task with these agendas, and that they are measuring and reporting on them on a regular basis. So when looking at the case of Peru, I looked at a watershed or a water stewardship program based out of Peru. And when comparing this to the national, I looked at the national review, or the voluntary national review. It does state in that document that the government will integrate the 2030 Agenda reporting into the Sustainable Development Strategic Plan. They haven't done so yet, but that is in the works. So in the future, that will be a document that can be looked to. So while it's not always the case, VNR typically, the VNR for Peru actually reports on all 17 Sustainable Development Goals at the national scale, so national progress for all of those goals. And this really does enable you to compare your own indicators with the countries, and you can also use the data that they're providing as a benchmark against your own work. So basically as a benchmark that you can work towards, or as a good comparison. An analysis at the program and regional levels against national level work, as I said previously, is also helpful to identify national reporting gaps that that organizations can help to fill. Where information from a country's VNR is limited, that other option is to focus on those national sustainable development strategies. In Uganda, the VNR actually highlights to look at Uganda's Vision 2040 as a document that can be used. But as the example in Peru, so what we've done here is taken all of the program outcomes that we've already mapped onto the SDGs, and then I've reviewed it in the actual VNR to see what data is being reported on a national level within the VNR. And you can see here that only one of the 4 different SDGs that I looked at were actually being mapped. And this is an important thing that can be highlighted when you're reporting back to funders and reporting out to the community, because they really are pieces that are very important. The more data we have available to measure progress in these areas, the better. And that takes me onto the regional scale. And the reason that I switched this is because The regional scale can be a bit more complicated sometimes. There is a often the documents aren't available at the regional scale as they are at the national level. So a regional sustainable development strategy might just might not exist. So if they don't, in lieu of that, one innovative way of measuring progress on the SDGs at this level is to take lessons from a collective impact approach, whereby multiple organizations, they would come together and jointly align their individual monitoring and evaluation frameworks to the SDGs. So similar to what we looked at the organizational or the sectoral scale, this can be done by each of the individual organizations and then come together to remap what everyone's collective impact is within that area. That's the concept behind this. So by collectively reporting at that regional level, organizations can communicate how their outcomes have played a part in a greater coordinated effort towards achieving the 2030 agenda at that regional level. This process can also help to identify gaps and areas of overlap across programs within a region or a sector. And this type of needs assessment, it can be a helpful tool in developing new programs and seeking funding for individual organizations, and also at a collective scale, because each project within that community impact or collective impact group can identify and report on how their individual efforts connect to that broader picture of impact. So this can be very ambitious work, depending on the number and types of organizations that are involved. However, you really can compartmentalize the work by focusing on maybe organizations in the region that are only focused on education or only focused on health, or maybe only organizations that your group works closely with in order to make the process a bit less daunting. So what this would look like at the regional scale, some steps you might want to take would be to first do an environmental scan of all of the actors, organizations that are in the area, in the region, who are working to, or who are contributing to the specific SDG or SDGs that you are interested in tracking. The next piece would to provide them with all of the information they need to do their own individual mapping exercises so that they can track their progress towards the sustainable development goals. From there, the group would come together in a workshop, or they would convene and talk about which key SDGs we're really focused on, where there are synergies within the SDG indicator reporting for each of the different groups, and where those gaps are. So while convening multiple stakeholders really can be challenging, the end result, it can be very powerful. Developing a regional SDG evaluation framework, if done properly, it doesn't need to be onerous or burdensome. In fact, like pooling funds to one qualified body to undertake an evaluation process such as this could be very impactful, and it can also increase individual organizations' capacity in the area of monitoring and evaluation. So it can be a tool that is very helpful for all groups involved and takes some pressure off of this issue of having to report back while also do the work at the same time. Now, finally, I just wanted to talk briefly about a few tools that you can use to communicate out the data that you're collecting and the information that you want to report on. So we have data, documents, and open and dashboards. So when looking, really when you're looking to move beyond just writing a report for a funder, and thinking about how you want to showcase impact, online dashboards really are a very good option. Dashboards can be used to show progress on the SDGs over time, and the data that's presented, it can be used to complement individual organizations' impacts. Dashboards can be themed. So this dashboard that we have tucked away in the back, the green one, it's health-themed data from the Canadian Institute of Health Information. Dashboards can also be an important source of data, such as this newly released resource watch site with the map and the pink header at the front. Or they can also be area specific, such as the San Jose SDG data portal in the back right-hand side. So finally, to be very clear, reports, they shouldn't be discounted as an important way to track and monitor progress on the SDGs. They may just want to make them more public, or to do that as a group effort, so that you are able to report out stories. You're also able to report out collective impact, specifically on the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the models that we use at the IISD is at the community level, and it's looking at community indicator systems. So these types of dashboards, they're very handy because they're convenient and easy to understand. Most importantly, they report publicly on progress over time and have the ability to disaggregate data at smaller geographical levels, such as communities, as well as in communities and regions. And they include different demographics as well. So you can report on the state of Indigenous peoples, women, youth, seniors, and so on. So this particular system, it connects community data to the SDGs as well, which provides an important area for you to be able to explain connections in detail. This really is helpful because explaining indicators, because it gives you a space where you can explain indicators that may just be proxies or that might link to overall goals, but are different from the agreed upon indicators that have been selected. And then finally, we have in the private sector, many organizations have taken to using their own websites to track their progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And larger aid organizations are able to contribute to larger databases that are then shared online, so that organizations can see where aid is being focused, to which countries, which sectors, all of that sort of information. So those are two different sort of areas where the private sector can also be involved, on top of the obvious presentation that Kelly gave us previously, to connect private sector individuals in private sector impact. So I will leave the presentation at that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. That was a really interesting deep dive into the world of indicators and monitoring evaluation frameworks and how they connect back to the goals. I just want to touch base with you, just for anyone who's not familiar with the idea around proxy indicators. Would you be able to just quickly say a bit about the difference between a proxy indicator and a normal indicator?
Yeah, for sure. So a normal indicator is just that. It's an indicator that would be directly connected to the indicators that are present in the Sustainable Development Goals. A proxy indicator is one where you may not be able to collect the information on an indicator for a specific reason, so you would use a proxy indicator. For example, or the indicator that is present may not be relevant to your situation. A good Canadian example is that in the SDGs, we report on malnutrition. So 2.2.1 and 2.2.2 talks about childhood nutrition and malnutrition and wasting. But really in Canada, that's not an issue. The issue is more around childhood obesity. So we would use a proxy indicator that's similar, but we would want to measure childhood obesity instead.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to dive into some questions now. There's been some good questions coming in. And so I'll start with the questions that are directed at you, Jennifer. But if anybody else has any other questions that have been coming to them as the presentation's been going on, please just type them into the chat box. We've already got a few here, but we can take a few more. So I'll start with the ones that are more focused at your presentations. You've just finished it. Jennifer, what is the website for the community indicator dashboard that you just displayed?
Yeah, for sure. So that's actually oh, I'm not muted. Okay, that is actually a prototype that we're developing at this point. So it is not online yet, but it will be soon. But if anybody wants to know more about it, they can definitely contact me, and I can give you access to it.
Excellent.
It's a model that we're using, and we're hoping to be able to replicate that. And give other people access to it. So
brilliant. And Kelly, so we can just hear you typing there. So if you could hold off on the typing because you're unmuted now as we're entering the questions and answering session. And okay, excellent. So if it's okay with you, would I be able to send your email out to folks who might be interested in that?
Yeah, that's
Jennifer?
perfectly fine. It's also at the very end of my presentation. So.
Oh, perfect. Okay, brilliant. That will be on the slides that we share. So just another couple of quick technical questions. Is there a central place that the national reviews for each country can be found? Are they filed with the UN, for example? Is there a central kind of storage place where past VNRs are stored?
Yeah, there certainly is. The United Nations actually, it can be found on the Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform. There's a section within that website that it uploads all of the voluntary national reviews for all of the different countries.
Excellent.
So I can share that link.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And one last one for you before we take a question from Kelly. Could you recommend a resource with a sort of a step-by-step process and supporting tools or exercises that we can use to workshop alignment of our current programs with the SDGs? Do any guides exist at the moment of how to sort of do what you've been talking about, essentially, how to make that alignment between programs and SDGs at the target and indicator level?
There aren't any that I know of specifically, but I am happy to take this presentation and put it into more of a step-by-step guide for you.
Excellent. Oh, that'll be wonderful. That's great, Jennifer. Well, I want to come back to you now, Kelly, to one of the first questions that came in, and just keep on firing questions in as they come. Somebody asked, I'd like to know how we can engage the private sector with the social economy. What opportunities do mapping the SDGs onto the work of groups working more in the social sector present for the ability to engage with private sector organizations? Any thoughts on that, Kelly?
Yes. Well, actually, I think collaboration between private sector and the kind of community sector are very critical for the SDGs. There's different ways that you can engage them depending on where you already are at with your programs and your engagement level. Some examples are, for instance, employee volunteering is a big focus coming up in the private sector. We're actually part of a coalition called Impact 2030, which is a private sector coalition specifically dedicated to mobilizing their human capital resources to the SDGs. And this community has involved pretty much all of your big multinationals of your SAPs, Ritz-Carlton, Google, Elderman, all of these organizations. So there is certainly an acknowledgement of using employee skills, knowledge, and also just providing opportunities for them to, again, develop their own personal growth through community activities. So employee volunteering is one. The second being, again, as mentioned, the value of the impact companies are having is directly affects the recruitment and retention of employees now. So helping provide better detailed impact reports would actually differentiate you in the competitive process of picking for granting sponsorships and things like that. So I think it's a win-win scenario of being able to come to the table with being able to provide them with better impact data, which helps their marketing team share their impact stories and kind of capture the value of their contributions, and then to actually providing them a mechanism to engage their employees in your activities. So then you can also get that additional support.
Great, thank you very much, Kelly. And then another question coming on the heels of that one was coming back to what you mentioned, Jennifer, around collective impact strategies in Canada. And this person has asked, do you know of any existing regional collective impact strategies around the SDGs in Canada?
Not offhand, but I would definitely argue that the work that you're actually doing, that BCCIC is doing around the SDG scorecards, is very similar to a collective impact work. Because it takes all of these different communities who are working towards the same thing, and you are using one scorecard to track that progress. That in and of itself is a collective impact model.
Oh, great. Thanks.
So, good job.
No problem. And just for those who aren't familiar with the work we're doing, essentially BCCIC is working with municipalities in British Columbia to map their existing official community plans and their municipal targets and indicators onto the Sustainable Development Goals, and then to try and fill the gaps with regional or provincial targets to show how collectively municipalities in British Columbia are moving the SDG agenda forward. And we're hoping to work with ISD and also the platform that they're using where we can sort of host this kind of information, which could be a great use for us. And just on that point, I'll also add that in terms of collective impact networks that I know of in Canada, Canada's we've just launched the Alliance 2030 network in Canada, and that's more of a national scale, and it's bringing together groups who are working on the SDGs across all of the goals and across all of Canada to look at how can we collaborate, share information, and basically move this agenda forward together. It's not as targeted as a collective impact network is. It's more almost like a constellation network where you have different sort of subnodes, but the idea is can we use the SDGs as a way to sort of channel our efforts and our impact through collaboration using the goals. And then the last thing I just want to quickly mention is that for countries working overseas, a lot of countries now have national SDG networks, especially in the Asia Pacific. If you're working there, and aligning your work around the SDGs could be an opportunity to, if you haven't already, become involved in those networks and explore collective impact at the country scale.
Just to add to that, I think that really touches on also. I like just to recognize to your point of how you're working with the municipalities to map out to the SDGs. As mentioned, most of you, most organizations, or what you might already have, the point is you already will have a metric or some sort of indicators that you're tracking within your organization. It just takes a step to start to map them to figuring out which SDG targets they would fit under. But once you start to do that, as mentioned, when you have all these other national networks and different things, it is just creating kind of a universal framework to get behind. So I think that's really the value of the SDGs, is taking what you're already doing and just putting it in a different term that can be more transferable beyond maybe your organization or local perspective to engage with partners in different areas. So I would definitely recommend that you start with what you have and look at that and just kind of go through the kind of what Jennifer was saying, start with the process of just looking at the targets, seeing which ones you could touch on or which ones you already are addressing or feel most passionate about, and it doesn't have to happen overnight. If you just start to align communications, you're already probably doing a lot of it. It's just changing the words to label your current indicator a little differently, so then it's more accepted by these other players who are already working with the SDGs. On that note too, in terms of support systems, there are a lot of national networks and then international networks depending on sectors. So for instance, we're a partner of Volunteer 2030, which is looking at the role of volunteers for the SDGs, Impact 2030, which is looking at private sector role for the SDGs, Alliance 2030, which you mentioned, is looking at Canada's role, and then there's Youth 2030, which is looking at youth role. So and there's Teach 20, SDGs is looking at educators' role. So there's a lot of groups coming up that are looking on basically sector-specific coalitions or groups to address the SDGs. So depending on what sector you're in, there's quite a few I know in the environmental sector as well, because then you're looking also at the Paris Agreement implementation too. So there's a lot of different networks and support groups. Sometimes they're just sector-specific. So if you can't find anything from a national level for your niche, try looking within your specific sector, and you'll find things pop up quite a bit that way. And then finally, our platform of MyEffect, what we actually look to do is provide you that universal framework. So we bring nonprofits and civil society with employers and private sector, and then citizens and young people all together in one platform to collectively track their impact against the SDGs, each reporting to that level of impact that the organization needs. So this is a way where you can meet your own personal objectives, but then have kind of that trusted data share between your stakeholders of communicating it down to an individual versus a funder level. So if you are looking for support or even advice on how to structure that, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to provide some more insight on that.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And I have a follow-up question coming in on that. Do you know of any Health 2030 type networks or collective impact groups? Anyone in the healthcare sector?
Yes, I can get if they contact me, I can look into that. I was just at a conference at United Nations yesterday, and there was some health groups that were talking about some global initiatives. So I'm sure there is a coalition like that. I don't know if it's called Health 2030 specifically, but I can definitely find some contacts within the health sector for you that would provide you some resources.
Excellent. And are you happy? Was your contact details provided on your slides? I forget.
Yes, they were. If you just, you can just do my info at myeffect.ca, and that will get to me.
Excellent. Great. And just kind of building on this conversation we're having around these different groups, I want to ask this question to both of you. It's a question that's come in around, are there any efforts to sort of roll this data up? So we'll be talking about how different groups and organizations can connect to the SDGs at the individual program level, or maybe they could come together as a collective and sort of pool the M&E data in terms of the SDGs the SDG sub-targets that they're impacting. But are you aware of any initiatives to do that, or at least, is anyone taking an environmental scan to link international efforts on each of the goals and targets?
That is what MyEffect's focused on specifically, where our focus is impact measurement and trusted data capture. So we are working to roll up data for governments, open data networks, looking at like charity and fund foundational giving, things like that. So definitely data aggregation and basically making better use and available of data for people's impact stories is what we're focused on. So if there's a specific kind of question or need around that, I definitely may have some answers for them.
Excellent, great. And how about you, Jennifer? Any ideas or any thoughts or information around efforts to kind of roll up local level data, regional data into a larger reporting framework, even at the country level, for example, the example you gave of Peru?
Yeah, for sure. Finland actually has a really good a good site that they've been they use in order to show progress on the SDGs across Finland. They have a really interesting model too, where you can pledge time, money, resources, that sort of thing as well to contribute to impact. I can find that link and send it along to you as well. And then the community indicator systems at a community level, that is essentially what they are getting at, is to track health, well-being, sustainable development across the city level and within neighborhoods, and connecting that to the sustainable development goals. And there's a way that we can work to see how to implement organizations' efforts as well within that model.
Great. I just have a quick question there. Does Finland, in the case of Finland, are they rolling up civil society data as well?
I believe that they are.
Oh, great. Excellent. Brilliant. Well, I think that is all of the questions that folks have sent in for the time being. I'll just, if there's any last questions.
I do see one from Karen. If organizations are already displaying SDG progress on their websites, I would say right now what we see is the private sector is taking a role. You see it more from the private sector right now, where they're aligning their annual sustainability reports or CSR reports to the SDGs. They haven't gone so far as to display the SDG progress. They're showing like maybe from a summary annual report, like we've committed to address these SDG targets. But with that being said, Karen, we actually, MyEffect has a widget, a free widget that you can put on your site that will show you your SDG progress. So this is an area of kind of data reporting and impact sharing that we're trying to address. So people are not doing it as actively yet, but we have developed a tool that organizations now can adapt to start to do that.
Thanks, Kelly. And Jennifer, were you aware of any organizations displaying their SDG impact or progress?
More in the area of municipalities. So I showed on the presentation that San Jose in California, they have an SDG dashboard, and Los Angeles as well is going to be releasing one, I'm assuming probably in the summertime, around the time when the high-level political forum is on. That's my guess. And we'll be releasing ours for Winnipeg in the middle of June to track how progress is happening in Winnipeg.
Great. And I'll just echo that and say that from what I've seen as well, it seems to be organizations at this stage are more mapping their work onto the goals. They're in that mapping phase. So you'll see community foundations of Canada, or some of the community foundations within Canada are showing their degree of alignment, but they haven't begun to track impact yet. So I hope that's the next stage that we're moving towards.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that at this point in time, most organizations, communities, municipalities, they really are at that mapping stage, which is exciting, which means that, if you are willing to take this step and do that mapping process, that, there's a lot of room and area for conversation around how to display the information and how we can creatively get it out there and connect it all together.
A lot of space for innovation and leadership at this stage. So
for sure.
It's exciting. Well, in that case, I think we're going to leave it there. We haven't had any more questions come in. A lot of thanks coming in from folks, so that's great to see. And I just want to say thank you once again to Jennifer and Kelly for taking the time to share your insights on how we can show our impact on the SDGs and why we would want to do that, the opportunities and advantages that creates. And I will be making a recording of this webinar available, as well as sending out slides to you shortly. And the links to those will be available at the end of the evaluation form. So please fill in your evaluation forms. There'll be the link there, and that'll help us understand how we can build on and improve our webinars into the future, and what are the topics you'd like to discuss around the Sustainable Development Goals. So a big thank you to everybody who was able to attend, and we look forward to seeing you on another BCCIC webinar. Have a great day.